There are faces in Hollywood that shine like constellations, faces that define decades, faces that seem carved from light itself. And then there is James Stewart, a man whose glow felt different, softer, warmer, almost familiar, like the quiet comfort of coming home after a long day. Audiences believed they knew him. They saw the gentle smile, the shy voice, the steady kindness in his eyes, and thought, there goes the most decent man in America. But the truth as always lived in the shadows that the spotlight could never reach. Behind that mild demeanor was a soul shaped by contradictions. The boy raised under the rigid expectations of a stern father, the young man who left architecture for the trembling uncertainty of the stage, the rising star who carried doubt like a second skin, and later the decorated soldier who returned from war with eyes that no longer reflected innocence but memory, heavy, silent, irreversible. Hollywood celebrated him as the embodiment of integrity, yet inside his heart lay rooms he never opened for anyone. Each role he played after the war seemed to hold a quiet ache, as if he were trying to reconcile the man the world adored with the man he had become. Even his greatest performances carried a faint tremor of longing, a kind of spiritual bruise only he could see. And still he endured. With grace, with humility, with the kind of sincerity that felt almost out of place in an industry built on illusion. This is not just the story of an actor, it is the story of a man who spent his life balancing light and shadow, fame and fear, love and the ghosts that followed him home. A legend defined not by perfection but by humanity. James Stewart's story begins far from the glittering boulevards of Hollywood in a small Pennsylvania town where life moved slowly and expectations were carved in stone. His family owned a hardware store that had been passed down for 3 generations, a symbol of stability, duty, and legacy. From the moment James was old enough to stand behind the counter, his father assumed he would inherit the business, and perhaps in another life he might have. But the quiet boy with long limbs and thoughtful eyes carried within him a restlessness no small town could contain. He grew up under the stern but loving gaze of his father, a man who valued discipline above sentiment. James admired him deeply but also feared disappointing him. That fear shaped much of his early life. He excelled in school, avoided trouble, and tried to mold himself into the kind of son his family expected. Yet something inside him resisted the idea of living a life already decided for him. He found escape in building model airplanes, sketching designs, and losing himself in the mechanics of flight. Machines made sense to him. They were predictable, logical, far easier to understand than people. When he earned a place at Princeton University, it felt like opening a window to a world that had been waiting just outside the frame. He studied architecture, a discipline that mirrored his orderly mind. But college also introduced him to a different kind of structure, the structure of a story. A friend dragged him into the university theater group, and for the first time, James discovered a space where he didn't have to be the dutiful son or the perfect student. On stage, he could become anyone, and ironically, that freedom made him feel more like himself than he ever had. Still, entering the world of acting was a terrifying choice. He knew his father would not understand. He knew people would doubt him. He doubted himself. He was tall, awkward, painfully shy, and spoke in a trembling voice that seemed to unravel whenever emotions ran high. Hollywood in the 1930 seconds wanted polished men, men who looked like they were carved from confidence. James Stewart looked like he had borrowed someone else's suit. Yet something in him refused to turn back. After graduating, he followed a group of Princeton friends to Broadway. He struggled, as all newcomers do. Casting directors thought he looked too thin, too uncertain, too gentle. He lacked the swagger they associated with leading men. But he carried something no one could teach: authenticity. When James spoke, no matter how nervous his voice sounded, people believed him. He wasn't performing. He was revealing. That sincerity caught the attention of producers who sensed potential beneath the awkwardness. Slowly, roles began to find him. And as he built a life on stage, he found companionship in the most unexpected of places, in a small shared apartment with another shy, lanky young actor named Henry Fonda. The two men became inseparable, bound by ambition, insecurity, and a shared sense of being outsiders in the industry they were trying to conquer. But James still lived with the echo of his father's expectations. Every step forward felt like a step away from the life he was supposed to live. That tension between duty and destiny, fear and courage, would define his early career. He wasn't meant to be a star. He was meant to be a man who worked quietly, steadily, anonymously. And yet, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. The boy who once built airplanes was slowly learning how to build himself. When James Stewart finally arrived in Hollywood, he did not walk in like a man destined for greatness. He walked in with the same hesitant stride he had as a child, shoulders slightly hunched, as if apologizing for taking up too much space. The studios were teeming with polished leading men whose confidence filled entire rooms: Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Gary Cooper. James was nothing like them, and everyone noticed. At first, Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He was too earnest, too polite, too unguarded. He didn't flirt with actresses to win roles, didn't drink to impress executives, didn't bluff or bluster his way through screen tests. He was simply himself, which ironically seemed almost radical in an industry built on manufactured personas. Casting directors were confused. Who was this man? Too shy for romance, too gentle for conflict, too awkward for glamour. But audiences, without knowing why, leaned in. There was something in his voice, that soft, trembling cadence that made even the simplest line feel honest. Something in the way he looked at his co-stars as if truly listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. Hollywood had seen handsome men before. What it had rarely seen was vulnerability. And in James Stewart, vulnerability wasn't a performance. It was a presence. His early roles were small, often unremarkable, but he approached each with the same earnest dedication. Directors noticed that he never complained, never asked for special treatment, and never tried to steal a scene. Instead, he grounded scenes. He gave other actors someone real to react to. By being understated, he made everyone else shine, and paradoxically, that is what made him shine. The true turning point came when director Frank Capra saw him. Capra had a gift for spotting the soul of a person beneath their outer shell, and in James, he saw what no one else had quite named yet: the embodiment of the American everyman. Capra cast him in You Can't Take It With You 1938, and suddenly the camera fell in love with him. His awkwardness became charm, his hesitation became sincerity. His emotional transparency, once seen as a weakness, became his artistic signature. Then came Mr. Smith Goes to Washington 1939, the film that changed everything. It was a role that required innocence, idealism, and moral resilience, qualities that were not written into James's performance, but woven into his very character. When he delivered the iconic filibuster scene, exhausted voice cracking, almost pleading, audiences were transfixed. They weren't watching an actor. They were watching a man fighting for something he believed in. The Academy Awards followed. So did the public's affection. But behind the applause, James carried a quiet disbelief, as if he had been invited into a world he wasn't sure he belonged to. Fame made him uncomfortable. Parties drained him. Yet work gave him purpose, and that purpose kept expanding. More roles, more acclaim, more respect. Then the Philadelphia Story, 1940, crowned him with an Oscar. Even then he insisted he didn't deserve it, claiming others were far more extraordinary. He remained humble in a city that rarely rewarded humility. But underneath the rising success, something deeper was stirring. His days of gentle roles, innocent characters, and untouched inner life were numbered. A storm far bigger than Hollywood was forming, and it was heading straight toward him. War was coming. And James Stewart was about to be transformed from the everyman into something he never expected. A soldier, a leader, and a man forever changed by what his eyes would witness. When the world tilted toward chaos in the early 1940 seconds, James Stewart found himself standing at a crossroads, unlike anything Hollywood could script. He was at the height of his rising career, beloved by audiences, admired by critics, financially secure, and poised to become one of the defining actors of his generation. But none of that mattered to him when the war began. Fame, comfort, applause, they felt trivial compared to the reality unfolding overseas. James didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without a press conference. He simply walked into a recruitment office and signed his name. It wasn't a publicity stunt. If anything, his studio begged him not to go. But James felt an obligation he couldn't ignore to his country, to his ideals, and perhaps to something deeper, a need to prove to himself that he was more than the gentleman Hollywood thought he was. Basic training was brutal. He was older than most recruits, thin, and not naturally strong. But he refused special treatment. He ran until his legs shook, practiced until his hands blistered, and pushed himself with a stubbornness no one had expected. Eventually, he was accepted into the U.S. Army Air Forces, becoming a pilot, a role that connected back to the boy who once built model airplanes in his childhood bedroom. But the war changed him. Not suddenly, but silently, like a slow-moving tide. He flew more than 20 combat missions, many deep into enemy territory. With each flight, he carried the responsibility of lives, both his crew's and the ones unseen on the ground below. There were missions where he returned, shaken, others where he barely spoke for days. Fellow officers later said he took every loss personally, even when he wasn't to blame. There was one mission in particular, the mission that haunted him the most. A bombing run that didn't go as planned. A miscalculation, a shift in wind, a moment of tragic distance between intention and consequence. Civilians were caught in the blast. No one blamed him officially. But James blamed himself. In his mind, the image never left. When the war finally ended, he came home, a decorated hero, eventually rising to the rank of brigadier general. Newspapers hailed him as a symbol of bravery, the kind of man America could be proud of. But inside, the return felt disorienting. Hollywood had stayed glamorous while he had lived in the shadows of fear, death, and responsibility. He didn't know how to step back into a world of scripts and cameras where danger was choreographed and wounds were painted on. Friends noticed the change immediately. The lightness in him had dimmed. He talked less, slept poorly, and carried a heaviness in his posture that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once clear and boyish, now held a quiet depth, a guardedness. Even Alfred Hitchcock years later said James came back a different man. And that difference is what made him fascinating. Hollywood tried to welcome him home with celebrations, but James found little comfort in applause. He felt like an outsider peering into the life he once had. Acting, once a passion, now felt like a fragile bridge he wasn't sure could hold the weight of what he carried. But there was one truth he couldn't escape. He had been changed but not destroyed, and that change would become the foundation of his most extraordinary work roles that could finally hold the darkness he could no longer hide. War had carved shadows into his soul. Hollywood would soon turn those shadows into art. When James Stewart returned to Hollywood after the war, he did not slip back into the industry like a man resuming an interrupted dream. He returned like someone walking onto unfamiliar ground, unsure if anything or anyone still belonged to him. The studios welcomed him as a hero. Audiences embraced him with nostalgic affection. But James felt different. The boyish idealism that had once defined him had been burned away somewhere above the clouds of Europe. That internal shift didn't go unnoticed. Directors sensed his gravity, the way he now carried silence like a second language. But it was one man, Alfred Hitchcock, who recognized that James Stewart had evolved into something far more compelling than the everyman hero he used to portray. Hitchcock saw the shadows behind the eyes, the fractures beneath the calm exterior, the emotional weight that war had etched into him. To Hitchcock, Stewart was no longer just a wholesome leading man. He was an actor with a secret universe inside him. Their partnership would redefine both of their careers. It began with Rope 1948, but it was merely a prelude. In Rear Window 1954, James played a man immobilized, trapped with nothing but his thoughts and fears, a role perfectly suited for someone who understood what it meant to be confined not by a cast, but by memory. The performance was raw in its restraint, filled with tiny flickers of anxiety and curiosity that made audiences lean closer. He wasn't acting the part of a man unraveling. He was channeling something deeper, something lived. But it was Vertigo 1958 that became the masterpiece not only of Hitchcock's career, but of Stewart's emotional truth. In Scotty Ferguson, James found a character who mirrored his own internal divisions, haunted by failure, plagued by guilt, driven by obsession, and unable to reconcile the man he wanted to be with the one he feared he had become. His portrayal was aching, vulnerable, unsettling. There were moments in Vertigo where the camera lingered on his face long enough for viewers to sense something almost painful simmering beneath the surface. It was as if Stewart allowed the world to see what he had spent years hiding: the ghosts of war, the heaviness of responsibility, the exhaustion of being seen as the embodiment of decency when he no longer felt entirely whole. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. The film underperformed, misunderstood by an audience not yet ready for its psychological depths. James blamed himself, thinking he had failed Hitchcock. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Vertigo would later be hailed as one of the greatest films ever made, a towering achievement of cinema, and arguably the most emotionally intimate performance of his career. Hitchcock eventually moved on to different leading men drawn to younger, more glamorous faces. The shift wounded Stewart more deeply than he admitted. He had found an artistic home in Hitchcock's world, a director who didn't fear the shadows in him. Losing that collaboration felt like losing a part of himself he had just begun to understand. Still, the performances remained. They outlived the doubts, the insecurities, and even the fading spotlight. Through Hitchcock, James Stewart reinvented himself not as a symbol of innocence, but as a man whose soul had been carved by experience. His characters were no longer just good men. They were complicated, fractured, striving just like he was. This reinvention marked the pinnacle of his artistic journey, but life with its quiet cruelty had a final act waiting, one written not by studios or directors, but by love, loss, and the inevitable passage of time. For all the complexities James Stewart carried inside him, there was one part of his life that remained beautifully simple: his love for Gloria Hattrick MacLaine. When they married in 1949, something in James softened. After years of uncertainty, guilt, and inner turbulence, Gloria became his anchor, calm, steady, unwavering. She had a warmth that steadied him, and a strength that matched his own quiet resilience. With her, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to be the hero, or the everyman, or the soldier. He could just be Jimmy. Their home was filled with the kind of domestic happiness he had never believed he deserved. Gloria embraced both his fame and his fragility. She understood the long silences, the nightmares, the nights when he paced the house instead of sleeping. She didn't try to fix him, she simply stayed beside him, and in that presence, James found something Hollywood could never give him: peace. Even at the height of his success, James remained modest, often crediting others for achievements that were undeniably his own. He admired Cary Grant with a mixture of affection and envy: Grant's effortless charm, his grace, his box office magnetism. James once joked that Cary lived the life people assumed he had. But Gloria reminded him gently and often that authenticity was its own kind of brilliance. And James believed her because he trusted her more than he trusted anyone else. As the years passed, he slowly withdrew from the frantic rhythm of Hollywood, not out of bitterness or decline, but out of contentment. He chose his roles carefully, worked only when he felt drawn to the material, and spent the rest of his days wrapped in the ordinary joy he had spent decades trying to reach. Family dinners, long walks, stories told at the kitchen table, watching old movies together, laughing at his own awkwardness. Then, in 1994, everything shifted. Gloria became ill. James stayed by her side every day, refusing to leave except when absolutely necessary. When she passed away, the loss cracked something in him that had survived war, fame, and time. Friends said he looked like a man suddenly hollowed out, as if the light inside him had finally gone out. After Gloria's death, he rarely went out in public. He declined interviews, appearances, celebrations, even honors. Hollywood, which had once been his second home, now felt unbearably empty without her. He spent his days in their house, sitting in the same chair where he had once read scripts, now watching old films, sometimes his own, sometimes hers. Nurses said he often fell asleep with the television still flickering, a blanket pulled up to his chin, a framed photograph of Gloria resting on the table beside him. Visitors who managed to see him in those years described him as gentle but distant, like someone already halfway between this world and another. Despite his frailty, he maintained his politeness, his trademark humility, and his quiet humor. But the man who had spent a lifetime balancing light and shadow no longer pretended to be whole. He didn't need to. He had given the world enough. In the final months of his life, he spoke often of Gloria, sometimes casually, sometimes as if she had just stepped into another room. It was clear that she wasn't a memory to him. She was a presence, a promise, a destination. When he passed away in 1997 at age 89, he left behind a legacy of films, a lifetime of integrity, and a final whispered truth that revealed everything about the man behind the legend. I just want to be with Gloria again. And in that simple longing, James Stewart offered the world one last glimpse into his heart, unguarded, sincere, and achingly human. In the long tapestry of Hollywood's golden age, there are stars who dazzled with brilliance, and there are stars who endured with grace. James Stewart was the rare kind who did both, not because he sought immortality, but because he lived with a sincerity that time could not erode. His legacy does not rest solely in his films, though they remain among the greatest ever made. It rests in the quiet courage with which he carried both the light and the darkness inside him. To watch Stewart on screen is to witness a kind of emotional truth that few actors ever achieve. His characters trembled, doubted, hoped, broke, and rebuilt just as he did. He brought humanity to heroism and vulnerability to strength. The world saw in him a reflection of its own fragility and resilience. That was his gift. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He simply allowed himself to be human. But beyond the accolades, beyond the iconic roles, beyond the image of the soft-spoken gentleman, was a man who lived a deeply private life, marked by devotion and loss. His love for Gloria remained the through line of his existence. Even at the height of fame, she was his true north, and when she was gone, the world dimmed in a way he could not hide. James Stewart did not exit life with fanfare or staged farewells. He slipped away as quietly as he had lived, gently, gracefully, without demanding attention, yet his absence was felt everywhere. In the softness of a spoken line, in the tremble of a remembered gaze, in the echo of a man who taught generations that strength could coexist with tenderness. And so his story ends not in triumph or tragedy, but in something more profound. A life illuminated by honesty, a heart shaped by love, a legacy carried in the quiet places where truth resides.